Imagine you are standing in a grocery store in Beirut. The year is 2020. Your phone says you have money in your account. The cashier's screen confirms the total, but the transaction fails. Not because your account is empty, because the bank has quietly, without announcement, decided that your money cannot leave. You try another machine. Same result. You go home with less than you needed. The number still exists. The purchasing power does not. And somewhere in that gap, between what the screen says and what your family can actually eat tonight, a very old question surfaces. One that people across the Middle East have been forced to answer not once, but repeatedly. Across decades of war, sanctions, currency collapse, and policy failure. What do you actually trust when the system stops behaving the way it promised? That question sounds philosophical. It is not. It is the most practical question a household can face, and the answer, every single time, has been more complicated than anyone expected going in. Start with Lebanon, because Lebanon is one of the most documented cases of a modern financial system eating itself alive. By 2019, the Lebanese pound had been pegged to the dollar for over 2 decades. That peg was the promise. It was the anchor that let people save, plan, borrow, and believe. Banks were advertising dollar deposit accounts with interest rates that seemed almost too good. And the reason those rates were high is the reason the whole structure eventually collapsed. The banks were not investing those deposits productively. They were cycling them back into the central bank, which was using fresh deposits to pay interest on older deposits, a financial system feeding on itself. When the cycle broke, the pound lost over 90% of its value in roughly 3 years. Salaries that had felt stable became almost meaningless. A teacher earning the same number on their paycheck was suddenly earning a fraction of what they had earned before. The number stayed. The life it could buy did not. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because the obvious assumption is that people who held dollars were safe. And some were. But the banks had introduced something called Lawler accounts, dollars that technically existed inside Lebanese banks but could not be withdrawn as real dollars. They could only be accessed at an official rate that bore no resemblance to the street rate. So people had dollars, on paper, in accounts, that they could not spend at anything close to real dollar value, nominal wealth, completely intact, real purchasing power, quietly destroyed. The number survived. The function did not. So what did people actually use? This is where it gets interesting. The street economy in Lebanon did not collapse into chaos. It adapted. Physical dollar bills became the real currency of daily life. Not accounts, not digital transfers. Physical paper that you could hold, hand over, and receive back. Landlords began demanding cash. Merchants priced in dollars and accepted only notes. The trust had moved from the institution to the object itself. And that shift, from institutional money to physical money, is something that keeps appearing across the region's history, in different forms, with different objects carrying the weight. Go back to Iraq in the 1990s. Sanctions following the Gulf War had created a different kind of monetary breakdown. The official Iraqi dinar existed. It was printed, it was legal, but its purchasing power was collapsing under the pressure of import restrictions, oil embargo, and government spending that had nowhere to go but the printing press. By the mid-90s, inflation had reached levels that made normal planning almost impossible. A civil servant's salary might cover a family for a week at the start of the month and almost nothing by the end. What emerged in parallel was a dual economy. In the Kurdish north, a different version of the dinar had been circulating since the early 90s, sometimes called the Swiss dinar, because the old notes had been printed in Switzerland before the Gulf War. Those notes were no longer being printed. Their supply was fixed, and because their supply was fixed, they held value in a way the newer inflating notes could not. People in the north preferred the old notes, not because anyone had officially declared them superior, because scarcity was doing what no decree could. A fixed supply created trust where an expanding one had destroyed it. That is the first real reversal in this story. The thing that held value was not the newest, most officially endorsed currency. It was the old one, the one the government had stopped controlling, the one that was slightly worn, slightly faded, and completely out of production. Primitive looking, more trusted than anything fresh from the mint. Now move to Iran, because Iran offers a different layer entirely. Sanctions have hit the Iranian rial repeatedly, and each wave has produced the same basic pattern with its own variations. When the rial falls, Iranians do not simply wait, they convert into dollars when they can find them, into gold coins when they cannot. The Iranian gold coin, the Bahar Azadi, has functioned as a savings vehicle for ordinary families for generations. Not because Iranians are uniquely sophisticated about monetary theory, because experience has taught them that the rial's relationship to its printed value is unreliable, and gold's relationship to its physical weight is not. A coin bought in 1980 still buys roughly what a coin should buy. A rial note from 1980 buys almost nothing. The lesson did not come from economists. It came from grandmothers who remembered the last time. But even gold has a complication. And this is where the story opens another layer. Gold preserves purchasing power across years. That is well documented. But in the middle of a crisis, in the days when shelves are emptying and people need to buy bread and fuel today, gold is not always the most useful thing to hold. It needs to be converted. It needs a buyer. It needs a functioning market, or at least a functioning person willing to trade. In the acute phase of a breakdown, the question of what preserves value over years and the question of what you can actually use tomorrow morning are two different questions. And the thing that answers one does not always answer the other. Yemen makes this painfully clear. The Yemeni civil war, which intensified after 2015, created a situation where two competing currencies began circulating in different parts of the country. One controlled by the internationally recognized government and one by the Houthi administration. Each side's currency was trusted in its own territory and deeply distrusted in the others. A merchant moving goods across the dividing line was essentially moving between two monetary systems with no reliable exchange. In that environment, what actually moved commerce was not currency at all. It was goods, fuel, food. The thing you needed was also the thing you could trade. The medium of exchange had collapsed back into the object itself. Money had not disappeared. It had dissolved back into barter, which is what money always was before enough people agreed to trust a symbol instead. That is the deeper pattern. Money is not a thing. It is an agreement. And agreements break under pressure. What replaces them is always something more immediate, more physical, more verifiable. Something people can hold, see, count, and trust without needing an institution to confirm the value. Egypt offers a slower version of the same dynamic. Not a war economy, but a chronic inflation story with its own distinctive texture. Egypt has devalued the pound multiple times in recent decades, most sharply in 2016 and again in 2022 and 2023. Each time under IMF pressure to let the currency find a more realistic level. Each devaluation hit ordinary Egyptians in a very specific way. Imported goods, which included a large share of basic food inputs, became immediately more expensive. Bread prices, cooking oil, pasta, the things that fill a working-class kitchen. The government subsidized some of these goods, which softened the blow but did not eliminate it. What Egyptian families did and have done across generations of currency instability is what families across the region have done. They bought gold when they could afford to. They kept some physical dollars when they could access them. They invested in real assets, apartments, land, anything that could not be printed away. The financial sophistication was not theoretical. It was inherited. passed down through families who had watched currency promises fail before. And here is the final complication, the one that brings the whole pattern into focus. Across Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Egypt, and every other case in this region where money has broken down or bent under pressure, the pattern is not simply that hard assets win and paper loses. It is more precise than that. What wins in the short term is whatever people can actually use to transact right now. What wins in the medium term is whatever stores value across the chaos. And what wins across decades is whatever holds the trust of enough people to function as both. Those are three different problems. And the mistake, every time, is assuming that solving one of them means you have solved all three. The person standing at the ATM in Beirut in 2020, watching a transaction fail, while the account balance sat unchanged on the screen, was not experiencing a shortage of money. They were experiencing the collapse of an agreement. The money was there. The trust that made it function was not. And what they reached for next, whether it was a dollar bill pulled from a drawer, a gold coin kept in a box, a bag of rice traded with a neighbor, it was not a primitive fallback. It was the oldest answer to the oldest question in economic life. What will someone else accept tomorrow? What still carries meaning when the official story has stopped being enough? The answer has never been simple, but history keeps asking the same question. And the people who survive the asking are always the ones who understood that money is not what the government prints. It is what people still believe in when the printing stops making sense.